Okay, good evening to all of you. Today we are almost caught up with a special thanks to Rabbi Handler. I'm sorry I was out the last couple of days, one with traveling, one with a child who's on the mend. So here we are, about two-thirds of the way down on Tzadi Gimel Amud Beis, a little bit above Tosfos Ki'ilu Lo Kiper V'Chiper. And we're starting with a question from the Gemara about smicha. The Gemara says, Iboyalahu Yado al Hatzdadin Mahu. In regards to doing smicha, what if the hands of the person doing smicha were not on the top of the animal, but they were on the tzadin, on the sides of the animal's face, on the jaws? I don't know exactly where it is, but somewhere on the sides. So says the Gemara, Tashma, Titania, Abba Bira, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Yado al Rosho. That's what the pasuk says, Yado al Rosho. B'chule b'samaches Yado. That's what the pasuk says, Yado al Rosho. Below Yado al Tzad, and that does not count as smicha. Next, Boy Rabbi Yirmiyah, Matlis Ma'usha Tachutz. Do we have a din of chatzitza in regards to doing smicha? About 12 years ago, somebody put a message through my website. How dare I refer to myself as a moel? I wrote on my website that I use sterile gloves. So he tained that doing a bris with gloves is a psul. So I wasted my time and wrote an email back. And the email that he had submitted as his email I wrote, Hol Arichus, you can find me marmakum. Yeah. So to my knowledge, there is no such marmakum.
No, by smicha, it's for samachas yado and nothing else. I don't think the word yad appears anywhere in that sort of meaning.
No, but
Meaning to say, like we had that case in the Gemara with that long knife for shechita. I'm not a proponent of that, but would it be a problem to use on a meal? I don't see why it would be.
it's impossible.
Other than
The logistics are, yeah. Nachanami.
You could be in the other room as we talked about, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? I think I'm gonna stay the moel and you do whatever you do. I don't know that I like your mahalach as a moel, but I do hear you. Like, let's say shchita, where we said the shochet was in the south of the Azara versus who cares? Yeah, the results. The shtickle, the results. The poskim do speak about more modern shuvas speak about using a laser for bris milah because it's an instant cauterizer where there's no dam bris. So these are these diunim. Yeah, that's an interesting. It would be great. It would be givaldic because the cutting would be perfect and there'd be zero blood, but it doesn't really work. So, okay. Anyways, is there a din chatzis? We've learned one line. What's going on? You did make it hard for me. Great. So it says the Gemara Tashma bavad shelo tehei davar chotzetz beino levein hazevach. You're not allowed. A little bit of an interesting quote because Mechatesi that it's specifically talking about, maybe it's out of context for us, but it's Gemara and Yuma. How do we know what we're talking about? Was that a din in the shechita itself, or was that a din in the smicha? But whatever the case is, the Gemara expands the brisa from Yuma that we're looking at here to even apply to smicha. At the two dots, 3/4 of the way down, minan immediately that uvishtei yadayim. How do we know that it needs to be smicha with two hands? Amar istak shtamar kluba samacharon eshtei yadav. Now, this yadav, the kri is yadav, but the ksiv is yado. So we're going to focus on that ksiv yado, ksiv shtei. So how do we stem the two? So it says Gemara zeh bona'av, and this was not intuitive. If you didn't see it, you wouldn't have said it. Kol makom shneimar yado in the ksiv form of yado, afal pi that yadav is read in the way of the kriya of yadav. Harei kan shtaim. We always assume that even the singular ksiv of yado is shtaim. Ad she'ifar l'cha kosiv achas. That is interesting. That every time you see the word yado, it's yadav unless otherwise noted. Azal Rebbe Lazar Amr Lahashmaisa B'vei Medrash, and he said this V'lo Amr Mishmei Reish Lakish. When he did this, Rebbe Lazar didn't quote Reish Lakish, which was a mistake. Rebbe Lazar was the next generation after Reish Lakish, but they clearly overlapped. This is where we begin to see the overlapping from one generation, one door of Amoraim to another. Obviously, it wasn't so clean cut. It's not like there was like 1 week when all of the next generation of Amoraim were born. It's not like that. So Rebbe Lazar, who we would have said is like a 3rd century Amora, normally we would have said that. So here we have to say that he's the shtickle second and the shtickle third, and Reish Lakish was a shtickle second. Anyways, Shama Reish Lakish ve'ikpid, he was upset. So Amar Le Reish Lakish says to Rebbe Lazar, Isal kadaitach, that kol heicha tichsiv yado tartininu, lama lelemechtav yadav. We have so many times in the Torah where it says the word yadav. And Ikshile Esrim Vidalid Yadav, because he knew Tanakh by heart, he dropped 24 psukim in Chumash, And in Tanakh, where it said that Yadav Tiviena, Yadav Ravlo, Shikel Es Yadav, Sikel Es Yadav, all of these examples that we are familiar with, all from Chumash. And Ishtik, Rebbe Lazar, he didn't even respond. In other words, Rish Lakish was trying to say, you think you're the Mar Makom here? I'm the Mar Makom here. You should have quoted me. And the Basar, the Nachdaite, after Rish Lakish calmed down, Amar le, my time yadav desmicha kamre. Why didn't you say that the principle that I said, this bana av of yado, that I read it as yadav and it always means shtaim, that it was only talking about smicha? Says the Gemara, you can't. Because besmicha namiksi bismoch es yadav alav vayitzavehu. Here we have a pasuk from Bamidbar Chav Zayin Chav Gimel. The pasuk says vayismoch es yadav alav. So you want to say that every time it says yado in the ksiv and we read it yadav, it's always by smicha. It's not true. It's just not correct. We do have an example by smicha where we have yadav in the kri and in the ksiv. So it's not like Rebbe Lazar's principle. Says the Gemara, but really Rebbe Lazar meant was smicha de behema kame. That was talking about something else. But when we talk about smicha de behema, it's taka true that the pasuk only is yado, the ksiv of yado with the kri of yadav. Says the Gemara, b'makom shochtim, ub'makom shesomchen shochtim tekef l'smicha shchita. What is the din of these two things? That in the physical locale in which you do smicha, you do shchita, and that immediately after smicha you do shchita. My kamar, hachi kamar. B'makom shesomchen shochtim, in the geographical place, not on the animal, but in the room in which you do the smicha, it has to be an immediate shchita. Shetekef l'smicha shchita. Meaning, because we have to bring close in moments of time the smicha followed by the shchita, so therefore the geographical location of the smicha has to be in the location of the smicha. One leads to the other. And that is what the Gemara says was that last end of the Mishnah. That brings us to a new Mishnah. The Gemara is now going to compare tnufa and smicha. We know that tnufa is found many times in Chumash, that one is obligated to do certain types of wavings with animal parts in their hands. We saw some of the halachos of this earlier in this Masechta, in the Gemara, and here in the Mishnah, a few lines from the bottom of Tzadi Gimel Amud Beis says as follows: Chomer b'smicha mi betnufa. There's something that's more machmir about smicha than about tnufa. Uvitnufa mi b'smicha. And there are things that are more machmir by tnufa than by smicha. So there's a chumrah by each one that doesn't apply to the other. So says the Gemara, let's get into it. Chomer b'smicha. Sorry, that's not right. She'echad menif l'chol hachaverim. Let's say that all of us go in together, and we buy an animal, and the animal parts that we bought into together require tnufa. So says the Gemara that by she'echad menif l'chol hachaverim, that one of the many of us are able to do the tnufa. We don't need more. But ve'ein echad somech l'chol hachaverim. But you can't have one person do smicha for all the others. If we all go in on a korban and that animal requires smicha, so then we each have to do smicha. So that's one nafkamina. That by tnufa, one can represent others, but by smicha, one cannot represent others. So that we see is a chumrah by smicha, where more people are obligated to get up out of their seats and go do what they need to do. Masha ein kain by tnufa. And chomer b'tnufa, what's the stringency by tnufa? Shal tnufa noheges. The application of tnufa is in a far broader set of cases. Where does tnufa apply? Shanoheges bekorbanos hayachid uvekorbanos hatzibor. It applies to individual korbanos, and it applies to korbanos of the tzibor. Tnufa applies, as we turn to the top of Tzadi Dalad Amud Aleph, bechayim. It applies to animals that are alive, uveshchutin, and it applies to animals that have been shechted. It applies ubedavar sheyesh bo ruach chaim, things that are alive, and ubedavar she'ein bo ruach chaim, such as a korban mincha. Right, a korban mincha was never alive. It's not an animal. It's just flour with potentially oil, but that's it. Yet we still see that there's tnufa. Ma she'ein kain b'smicha. End of Mishnah. So let's review. The chumrah by tnufa is that it applies in a broader set of cases, and the chumrah of smicha is that whereas by tnufa, if we all go in on a korban, one person can do tnufa for everyone. By smicha, you can't. By smicha, everyone has to do their own smicha. So says the Gemara, 3 lines down from the top on Tzadi Dalad Amud Aleph, Tanu Rabbanan. we have a brisa. The brisa quotes the pasuk of Korbano, and if you look on the side, the pasuk is Vayikra Gimel Ches. The pasuk says V'samach es yado al rosh Korbano v'shachato so v'chule. So Korbano l'rabos kol baalei korban l'smicha. All of the baalei korban, all of the individuals who participated in funding and purchasing a korban, each of those individuals must do smicha on their own. Shayachol v'halo dinhu. You might have thought that it was not that way. This is quite a nuanced and complicated kal v'chomer, and it's only a havamina. We're going to reject it with a pasuk, but let's at least go through it as to why we would have perhaps thought that by smicha even one person can represent. So it says the Gemara as follows: Uma tnufa, just like tnufa shenitzrab b'shchutin, where we see that it applies in many cases of shechted animals. Remember, we said korbanos yachid and korbanos sibur, and b'chayim uv'shchutim. So we said it applies there. And there, nismata b'chovrin, there we said we can have a minority of people doing tnufa from the group. Only one is necessary by tnufa. Well, smicha shelo nisrapsa b'shchutin, eino din shetismait b'chovrin. Maybe we should say that that because by smicha, the application is far narrower than tnufa. Tnufa has a lot of applications. Smicha has very few. So if tnufa has a lot of applications and one person can do tnufa for others, then smicha, which has few applications, maybe we should say only one person can do smicha. It's a good kal v'chomer. Eino din shetismait b'chovrin. All the more so we should say that by smicha, one person should be able to represent for everyone. A good kal v'chomer. Talmud Omar korbano lerabos kol ba'alei korban l'smicha. So this is the understanding of the brisa, is that even though we had a potential kal v'chomer, which would have yielded the result of one person doing smicha for others, Talmud Omar korbano, that because of the word korbano in the Chumash, so therefore when it comes to smicha, even if all of us are functioning bechabura, we all bought in, but at the end of the day, the Torah obligates each of us to do smicha on the korban on our own. Says the Gemara, "V'tisrabe tnufa b'chovrin." Why we know, of course, that by tnufa, it's only one person can represent. But perhaps we should have thought, and that's what the Gemara's havamin is, "V'tisrabe tnufa b'chovrin," that each of us has to do tnufa. In other words, why would we allow only one person to do tnufa? We should have allowed or required all. And mikal v'chomer. Uma smicha, now let's look at an inverted complex kal v'chomer. Uma smicha shelo nisrab b'shchutin. Just like by smicha, which has very few applications, it only applies it by a very rare scenario of live animals. And there nisrabsa b'chovrin, there we say that by smicha we don't allow one person to represent, but rather all of the people who bought into the korban are obligated to do smicha on their own. Well, tnufa shenisrabsa b'shchutin, eino din shenisrabsa b'chovrin, then tnufa, which does apply in many cases, it applies by tzibur, by korban yachid, it applies by chaim and by shchutin, davar sheyesh bo ruach chaim, davar she'en bo ruach chaim. Well, because tnufa is allowed in so many applications, so perhaps we should have said that nisrabsa, that eino din shenisrabsa b'chovrin. Then all the more so we should say that when it comes to the world of tnufa, that we shouldn't allow for one person to represent others, but rather everyone individually should have to do their own tnufa. But that's not the din. So says the Gemara, that's not because of a pasuk. The reason why we don't obligate each individual party of a chabura to do tnufa on their own is mishum delo efshar. We're a quarter of the way down on tzadi dal and aleph. It's not physically possible. Why not? Why is it not possible for all of us, the four of us, to do tnufa on the same animal? Says the Gemara, because heichili avid. What do you want to do? Let's say you got 10 guys in the room and all of them ponied up for an animal. You want all 10 guys to do tnufa? It's not possible. Lifnu heichili avid. Linfu kulhu bahade hadade. If you want all 10 people to do the shakings of the animal at the same time, it's not physically possible. Just surface area of the animal to find a place for everyone to put their hands. Kahavya chatzitza. Pasha doesn't work. There's no way that we could have it be the case that everyone's hands can fit. And if you want to say leinav v'lehader v'leinav, person number one, you do tenufa. Okay, you're done. Pass the animal to person number two, and then he'll do tenufa v'chulei. If you want to say that, that's not what the Chumash said. Tenufa amarachmana v'lo tenufos. So therefore, we've answered up both of the uniquenesses of our Mishnah. We had initially said that smicha needs to be done by each individual because of the pasuk of korbanon. And then we said that tnufa can be done even by one person, not because of a pasuk, but because of a practical, pragmatic concern, which is it's not physically possible to get it done that way. And therefore, that is the basic dinim of the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, usmicha b'shchuta lesa. We had said in our Mishnah that one of the uniquenesses of Tnufa, the Chumrah of Tnufa, is that it applied in so many cases. Korbanos Yachid, Sibur, B'chaim, B'shchutim, Davar Sheish B'rochem, Davar Shem B'rochem. And then we said Smicha only applies by Chaim, by living animals. Says the Gemara, I'll prove to you that that's not true, and I'll do so from a Mishnah that is in Maseches Tamid. What does the Mishnah in Tamid say? If there is a Kohen Gadol who is interested in being maktir and burning the emurim, the leftover parts of the animal, you may recall from many years ago we discussed this, that the animal was cut up into pieces and put on the kevesh, put on the ramp in different places. And then there was a lottery that a Kohen would be able to do one part of the emurim, he'd get the rosh and the regel, another person would get the front legs and the vichuli, all of those things. So let's say the Kohen Gadol says that he wants to put the emurim on the mizbeach. So what would he do? Haya ola bekevesh ve'askan biyamino. The Kohen Gadol would go up the ramp, and the skan, the assistant Kohen Gadol, he would be standing to the right of the Kohen Gadol. Higia lemachzis hakevesh. When they would get halfway up the ramp, achaz skan biyamino ve'elehu. So then the skan would hold on to the Kohen Gadol with his right hand and help him move up higher. And then the Kohen who won the initial lottery to pick up the first animal, that Kohen would be Behoshit lo harishon harosh ve'haregel. The first Kohen that won the lottery to be able to place the rosh and regel on the actual fire, he will then hand it to the Kohen Gadol, who will now be doing it on his behalf in his stead. And what does the Kohen Gadol do? Look at this. Somech aleim. Now, is this animal dead or alive? So Pasha, this animal is already nitach l'insochav. The pasuk in Chumash told us that this animal was cut into pieces. Look what we're talking about, a rosh and a regel. You can't have a rosh and have the animal be alive. It doesn't work that way. So therefore, we see that there's smicha. The Mishnah continues. Hoshir Hasheni, the Rishon Shtei Yadayim. The second Kohen who won the second part of the lottery, he picks up the front legs of the animal. Nosno la Kohen Gadol, Nosno Kohen Gadol, Somechalem V'Zorka. There too we have smicha. Then the Kohen Gadol throws them on the fire. Nishmat Hasheni, the second Kohen goes down. V'halach lo, goodbye. V'kachayim Moshitim lo sha'ar kol ha'ivarim Somechalem V'Zorka. This applied until every animal on the kevesh was put away, was put onto the fire. And if he wants, the Kohen Gadol can do the smicha, and the other Kohanim are allowed to do the zrika. Nevertheless, what I would have expected the Gemara to say is katani mihas, which would have been normal syntax. I don't know why it's not here, unless it's just so obvious, as it says that there's smicha multiple times here by shchutin. So this is a kasha in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah seemed to say that there was a chumrah by the world of Tnufa that it applied to so many cases, and smicha only applied by living animals. Not true. Mishnah from Tamid. Says the Gemara, Amar Abaye, Hasar Mishum Kvodo de Kohen Gadol. Rashi is a different girsa. Rashi says right before the Mishnah, toward the top of the page, right before the break in the Rashi, Mishum Yikra de Kohen Gadol. A little bit of the same word, same, whatever. One in Aramaic and one in Hebrew. But nevertheless, it's Mishum Kvodo de Kohen Gadol, but not for regular smicha purposes, but rather just to show kavod to the Kohen Gadol. Hadran Allah, Shtei Midos, Baruch Hashem. We finished the 10th parak of Maseches Menachos. Not too long to go, just a couple of weeks left with this Masechta, and then we move on to Chulin. Yuratzon, we should come back to this daf in 7.5 years. Let's now talk about the next parak, which is the parak of Shtei Alechem, which speaks about how we make the chalas. Now, I'll just say at the outset that elements of this Gemara are a little difficult to understand because we're using words to try and understand the physical shape of the Shtei Alechem, of the Lechem Aponim, as they were built. We will see pictures. Nisht Pashut. It's not so exactly Pashut as to some of the Shaklavataria here, but I'll do my best to be as clear as I can with my level of understanding of the Gemara. Let's start at the new Mishnah, at the new Perek Tzadi Dalam and Aleph, 2/3 of the way down. The Shtei Alechem, which are brought on Shavuos, Niloshos Achas Achas. They are needed individually. They're not made in one thing and then parsed out. They are kneaded separately. Menachos achas achas, and they are baked one at a time. Lechem apanim, in contrast, niloshes achas achas, they too are similar to the shtei lechem in that they are kneaded separately. K-N, not N-E-E. They are kneaded separately. But v'nefos shtaim shtaim, but they're baked in pairs. Much more efficient considering the number of challahs that you have to bake. The shtei lechem was 2. The lechem apanim was more. However, unlike the shtei lechem, the lechem apanim were actually put into a pre-made form. Says the Gemara, ubidfus haya ose osan. The dough was put into a form. We're going to discuss this a little bit more right now. Uchshehu rodan, you may remember from Maseches Shabbos there, Daf Dal, Redias Hapas. There, the Rishonim pointed out that taking challah out of an oven was considered a chachma. It was considered something that was that required a particular skill. So this is the same word over here from back in Maseches Shabbos that we learned about 5 years ago. Shehu rodan nosna l'tfus kadesh lo yiskalkalu. And after they took out the challahs, they were then put into another form to maintain the shape. All of this by the lechem apanim. Good. So the Gemara starts out by saying, Minohanimili, how do we know the halachos of our Mishnah, especially the fact that it was kneaded one at a time, but when it came to baking it, the shtei lechem was cooked individually. They were baked one at a time, and the lechem apanim was not. They were cooked 2 at a time. How do we know all of this? The Tanu Rabbanim. The rabbis taught us in a brisa based on a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Chav Dalet. Shnei esronim yihye hachala ha'echos. Shnei esronim. So that's talking about the shtei lechem. Each one was 1 isaron. And what does the pasuk say? Hachala ha'achas melamed sheni loshos achas achas. We therefore see that the shtei lechem, the dough was kneaded 1 at a time per challah. Again, we didn't make a large chunk and split it in 2, but we did flour, water, whatever their ingredients were for 1 challah, and then they did the same thing for the other one. They were kneaded separately, different bowls. And minayin she'af shtei halechem kach. That pasuk was, how do we know that that's true by the shtei halechem? Talmud lomar yihye, because of the extra word yihye. Uminayin she'af yasan shtayim shtayim. How do we know by the lechem apanim that unlike the shtei halechem, that the lechem apanim was cooked 2 at a time? Talmud lomar v'samta osam. You should place them into the oven. So the them is obviously, that's very good evidence that the lechem apanim was cooked 2 at a time. Yochol af shtei halechem kain. Why would we not say that the shtei halechem were cooked 2 at a time? Mechatesi, that shtei halechem were baked 1 at a time. Talmud lomar osam. Oh, that's a problem. We just said that word was a drasha 1 line ago. We just tried to say that we know that the lechem apanim was baked 2 at a time from the pasuk of asam to osam. And on this line, we're saying osam is a miyut. It's an exclusionary word to teach us that only applies to the lechem apanim and not to the shtei lechem. Says the Gemara, hi osam ha apikte. You already used that word osam for a drasha 1 line ago when you said v'sam to osam, that by the shtei lechem we only do 1, and by the lechem apanim we do shtaim shtaim. So how can you use the same word twice? Says the Gemara, im kain lema kra v'samtam. The pasuk doesn't say v'samtam. It went out of its way to add a word. My v'samta osam. We know how to conjugate words in Hebrew. We should have taken v'samta osam and said v'samtam. We don't always talk like that in modern day Hebrew, but in Chumash we try and save every word. So therefore we see that because both words were used when we could have used one, shamas mine tarte, that we can learn from the words v'samta osam 2 things. The first thing we can learn is that by the lechem apanim they were afyasan shtaim shtaim, and the word osam also doubly functions as a miyut to exclude shtei halechem, and therefore the shtei halechem was cooked achas achas, and that's how we get through the beginning portion of our Mishnah. All right, let's get into the Shaklavataria about what the lechem aponim actually looked like in the Beis HaMikdash. Let's remember that there was a shulchan that was made out of gold. And as we'll see on the next page in pictures in Rashi, in the Oz V'Hadar Gemara, we have pictures in Tosfos as well about what exactly was going on. Tanu Rabbanon, the rabbis taught us in a brayso, v'samta osam bidfus. We learned in our Mishnah that the challah for the lechem apanim was put into a dfus, was put into some type of form. And the Gemara says over here in the brayso, shlosha dfusim heim. There were actually 3 forms that were utilized. Nosna l'dfus ve'adayin hi batzek. The first one was a form that was utilized for batzeik. And the second one was uchmin fus hayala betanur. The second one was to maintain the shape of the form in the oven. So it was moved from the dough one into the baking one. Shahaya wrote that when it was moved from that form, nosna b'tfus kadesh lo tiskalkel. Then it was taken out of the oven and put into nachmal, the third shape, in order to ensure that the shape stayed exactly the same. So there were three different molds: the dough phase, the baking phase, and the post-baking phase. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. V'lahadra l'dfus kama. After the baking is done, put it into the original shape. Why did you have a different shape? So the Gemara gives a very obvious answer. Kevan de'afela nafcha. When something bakes, it expands. So let's say the volume of the dough was 20 cubic inches. Okay, now it's 25 cubic inches. It doesn't fit anymore. So we need to now start over. We need to find another kli. So there was another mold that was used for the post baking phase, because the challahs, after they came out of the oven, were larger than when they were initially put into the oven. That brings us to the last line of Tzadi Daled Amud Aleph. Says the Gemara as follows: Itmar. We have a statement from the Amoraim. Lechem aponim ketzad osanoso. Very important. Shas machlokas. How were the lechem hapanim made? What was their shape? Let's turn to the top of Tzadi Daled Amud Beis. Says the Gemara, Reb Chanina Amar kimin teva prutza. If you have the Rashi with pictures, you'll see that on the inner margin of the page, there's a picture of Rashi, which looks like a U, a short U. It's kind of cut. There's an open space in the middle. Maybe it looks like a field goal, whichever is the appropriate mashal for you and your sports proclivities. So this is called a teva prutza, teva because it looks like an empty box. Teva prutza. It's a box that's open at the top. Rabbi Yochanan Amar kimin svina rokedes. It's like a ship that is dancing. So if you look at the V shape underneath, it looks like the cross section of a boat that had a very pointy bottom. And this is the difference between them. So now we're going to ask a few questions that support the first shita, which is the shita of Reb Chanina. And then we're going to ask a few questions that support the shita of Reb Yochanan. So the first three questions are in support of Reb Chanina. Bishlam, according to Reb Chanina, Lamanda Amar Kimin Teva Prutza, that I could understand the Teva Prutza, the one that looks like a U, that I understand, Hainu Dahabu Yasve Bazichin, because I could put the Bazichin inside that open space on the topmost challah, no problem at all. That's where the bazichin would go. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that it was this little V shape, well, the volume of space inside the V shape is not as large as the volume of space inside the U shape, and therefore, hechi havu yasve bazichin. So says the Gemara, makom aviduhu, they would carve out enough space. Don't worry, we'll make it work. We'll thin out the bread. However they did it, they made enough space. So question asked and answered. Reb Chanina makes it through the first question. Question number two is as follows. Bishlam alamanda amar kimin teva prutza. I understand the sheet of Reb Chanina that it looked like a U shape, the lechem apanim chala, hainu dahavu yasve kanim. There were these bars that were placed across the lechem to rest on top of them, so we could put another bar on top, another challah on top of them. What we didn't want was for the two challahs to be touching, because that could mold. So what they would do is put a bar in between them, and that way the bar would separate the challahs so that it wouldn't mold. The problem is that if you have a U shape like this, so that rests nicely. But the V shape like this actually doesn't rest nicely, because if you look at the pictures, you'll see in the V shape that a bar lying on top of the top one rests flat. But the bar lying on top of the bottom one of the Sfina Rokedes is only touching the corners. The Gemara assumes, again, these are some of the complexity of the Gemara, that the kanim, the bar, won't sit nicely on the Sfina Rokedes, and that's the Gemara's question over here. Let's look at it again. It's 5 lines down. The bar would sit nicely on top of version number 1. It wouldn't sit nicely. It would be only sitting on the corners of the challah. Perhaps it would break the challah. We know that there's a lot more pressure when things are pointed. I don't know. It could be that it would break the challah. So the Gemara answers, Mursha avid lahu. They added a little bit of dough. in order to flatten out the edges of the Sfina Rokedes type of challah. Good. That was question 2. Let's look at question number 3. I understand Reb Chanina and his shita that it was a teva prutza. If you look at one of the pictures of Rashi on the bottom, you'll see that there are these vertical beams that kind of press the challah from side to side. Can you see those on the side there? So that, according to the Gemara, makes sense when the shape of the challah is teva prutza, because they're more boxy, and therefore the vertical supports, they align perfectly with the sides of the challahs. According to the shita, that the lechem was in the shape of Sfina Rokedes, that it was in this V shape. So hechi samcha lesfinim lechem. The vertical supports would only touch one tiny little point on the vertical on the lechem, but because it was Sfina Rokedes, it didn't touch anything else. It was only 6 little tiny contact points on each side. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. Says the Gemara, "De'agil le me'agil." And this is a discussion in the Meforshim as to what this means. De'agil le me'agil seems to be that there were basically things that were protruding. I guess the picture at the bottom there is kind of the best way to look at it. The bottom picture in Rashi. So what I have is the lighter color. The lechem is that internal color. And then underneath that were these kind of rounded supports coming off of the snifim that would fit perfectly between the lechems. So that's what le'agil nami, the agil hu me'agil actually means. Good. Now, all of that was in support of Reb Chanina. 3 questions, 3 answers. Now we're going to move to supporting Reb Yochanan and ask 3 questions against Reb Chanina. Halfway down on Sadi Dalet Amud Beis. Says the Gemara as follows. B'ishlam alaman do amar kimin sfina rokedes, hainu de ba'inan snifin. I understand the shita of sfina rokedes. That's why we needed the snifin, we needed those bars in order to stabilize them. Elolaman de amar kimin teva prutza, snifin lamali. Why do I even need the support bars? Remember that if we have things that are boxy, they sit perfectly fine. I don't need side vertical support beams for my challahs that are square. They can sit on their bottoms and they're totally fine. So says the Gemara, Agav Yukra de Lechem Talach. We were afraid because of the Yukra de Lechem, because of how heavy they were, that Talach, that they would actually break. A little bit of an interesting word, the word Talach. And apparently it means to break. I've never seen the word before in this context, but that is how it's understood over here. So that's why, even though it's true that the lechem, according to the version of Rabbi Chanina, would sit nicely, it's true, but we needed the support beams from the side to depressurize how much weight was falling on the challahs beneath, because they could break from all of the weight. Question number 2. I understand the sheet of Rabbi Yochanan, snifin al gabe shulchan munachin, that the snifin, they could actually rest on the shulchan. That I get, because there's space for them to have things intercede underneath the angled parts of the challah. But according to the shita of the teva prutza, the shita of Reb Chanina, snifin, Heichi manachlu, where would they be resting on the table? After all, the bread took up all the space of the table. The width of the challah, according to Reb Chanina, took up the whole space. A'ara manachlu? Do you want to say that the snifin were resting on the ground? So says the Gemara, that's actually exactly what I'm saying. And then the Gemara continues with a meimra from an Amora to clarify what's going on here. To Amar Rabbi Abba bar Mamel. L'divrei ha'omer kimin sfina rokedes, according to the shita of Rabbi Yochanan, who holds that the shape of the lechem apanim was kind of V-shaped, like the sfina rokedes, snifin al gabe shulchan munachim. You're right. The snifin, the supports, would be able to have these things that kind of protruded from the snifin to support up those angular snifin rokedes. And then the Gemara says, L'divrei ha'omer kimin teva prutza, according to Rabbi Chanina, who holds that the challah was in the shape of a U shape and it was flat bottomed, snifin al gabe karka munachin, taka true, it's exactly right. and they would rest on the bottom. So that's the difference between the two pictures in Rashi. According to the first picture in Rashi, you can see that the snifin are resting on the ground with the shulchan being supported as well. But according to the second approach in Rashi, you can see that the snifin are all on the shulchan. There's nothing from the ground. It's all shulchan and higher. That's the machlokas between them. Says the Gemara 3 lines from the bottom. Says the Gemara as follows. Keman az lahodatanya the Amar Yehuda halechem mamid esa snifim. The bread is helping to support the snifin. The snifin ma'amid and esa lechem. That must be obviously Keman to Amar Sfina Rokedes, because they're kind of playing off of each other. There's part of the snifin that are on the ground, and then there's part of the snifin that's holding up the chalas, and they are kind of co-supporting each other. So says the Gemara, wait 1 second, and we're going to stop in about 6 lines at Iboyalahu. Says the Gemara, Meisvei, we have a question, and this is going to be against Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan was of the opinion that the shape of the chalas was Kisvina Rokedes, like that V shape we saw in Rashi. But what do we see in the Brisa? Kimin kaveres hayala betanor. There was some type of basket that was inside the oven. The dome kimin tavla merubas. What shape was the basket? What shape was the mold? It was square. Whose shita is it that the lechem upon him was square? Reb Chanina. Reb Chanina said exactly on the top line, exactly 1 amar ago, Reb Chanina amar kimin teva prutza. So if the mold was that shape, yeah, it's you're done for, Reb Yochanan. How can you say that that the shape of the lechem aponim was kesvina rokedes when the brisa that we have right here says that the form, the mold inside the oven for the sake of the lechem aponim was kimin tavla? Ema, you're right, and perhaps, and this is where we begin to see possibly a third version of what the challah could have looked like. Ema, you're right, maybe it was upiha dome kimin tabla merubas. Maybe only the opening of the challah was kimin tabla merubas. So you have a cutout, right? So it does kind of look like kind of this upside down U, but the rest of it was V-shaped underneath. So it would be this kind of shape over here. It's V-shaped, and then up, and then an opening in the middle. So definitely a unique shape. No drawings here. It actually looks like a blend of the two pictures. And Tanya, we have a brisa, Kemando Amar Sfina Rokedes. We have a brisa like the Shita of Rabbi Yochanan that it in fact was a Sfina Rokedes. To Tanya, Arba'a Snifin Shel Zahav Hayusham. There were 4 branches to support Mefutzel and Meroshem Kimin Dekarnin Hayu Shesomchen Ben Alechem Shudome Kimin Sfina Rokedes. The brisa says black on white that it was in the shape of a Sfina Rokedes. So obviously, this Shakla B'Tari is it's nuanced a little bit. We don't really have some of the Metzias, at least it feels that way. But that is the broad machlokas between Reb Chanina, who holds that the Lechem Apanim was Kimin Teva Prutza, and according to Reb Yochanan, it was Kesvina Rokedes. And if we were to pause right here, which we will for the day, it does seem that we paskin that it was a Sfina Rokedes, shaped like that V shape that we can see in Rashi on the inner column on Sadi Dalet Amud Beis toward the top of the page. We'll pause right here, 6-7 lines down to the Boyalahu, wishing you all a beautiful night.